Today, we're going to be looking at Vue.js, and specifically, we're going to be looking at how you can use the command line application and the GUI that's provided with it to start building full-fledged Vue applications. And we'll talk a little bit about the structure of a Vue application and how you can go about creating scalable projects. So I'm going to assume that you've seen my previous two tutorials on Vue, which will get Vue.js and the command line application installed on your computer, as well as talk a little bit about what the sorts of things you can do with Vue are, the general syntax for working with Vue, that sort of thing. So if you haven't seen those, go check those out. But for now, we're just going to get started on using the command line application. So to do this, we need to open up a terminal here. So I'm just in my text editor, going to open up my terminal. And then if you have Vue installed, you should be able to type Vue UI and click enter, and you're going to see this is starting a GUI. So it's running on localhost. It's going to pull open my browser here, and you see we get this Vue project manager. So this is where you're going to be able to create new projects. We'll just click on the create button, and then you can see that we get to pick the location. So I'm just going to create a new project here, and then we just have to give it a name. So I'm just going to say Vue.js tutorial. You can see that we can pick its package manager. I'm going to select npm. You can leave this on the default. It should be npm by default. All sorts of different options here. We don't need to worry too much about them right now. Just click next. I'm just going to select the defaults so that it gives me some things to begin. Again, right now, it's not super important what we're picking here. And then we're going to just create the project. So now that that's done running, you can see that we're on our project dashboard page here. So this page is going to give you some tips and let you sort of control the application that you just created. So I'm just going to click understood here. You can read through that if it gives you useful information. I just want to show you a little bit about what can be done from within this dashboard. So you can click into plugins, and you can see that we see the different plugins that we have available. You can easily add new plugins to your project from this interface here. You can also see the dependencies, so you can see what is it that your application requires to actually run, including versions. You can go into the configuration and actually set up some of your settings, and then you can come into tasks. And tasks is where you're going to be able to actually run the application, as well as build it for production. Of course, you can also lint, or you can inspect your application here as well. So now I'm just going to go over to plugins, and I actually want to just add the Vue router to the file. So I'm going to click this add Vue router. It's going to say, give you the details. I'm just going to click continue, and you're going to see it's installing the Vue router. Now, as a word of caution, you're going to want to do this before you start changing the project files, because when you add the Vue router to your project, it's actually going to overwrite what you do in your main file. And so any changes you've made won't be saved if you add that after the fact. So if you need to add the Vue router later on, you're going to want to back up that file, add the router, and then go back in, paste in the code that you've used before. So with the Vue router installed, I'm going to come into tasks, I'm going to click serve, and I'm just going to click run task. So this is actually going to start up our server. You can see it's building over here. We get the nice sort of stats about it. And then I can click this button, open app. This is just going to open another page, and you can see it's just running on localhost at port 8080. And what we have here is a rather simple Vue application. So if I go back into my text editor, we'll just open this up here. I'm just going to open up my file explorer, and you can see that this Vue.js tutorial directory was created. If I open this up, you can see that we have a public, we have a source, and then we have some package specification files. Just about all of the code that you need is going to be going into the source, and then the public is what's generated for the actual application. If I go into the source folder and I click on main.js, if you've seen my previous video, you should notice that we're sort of doing something similar here. So we have this new Vue command, and then we're mounting it to the app element, right? So this is sort of like specifying that the L equals app, right? And so this main.js, just really all it's going to be doing is start up the application. You can see that we're importing the router, which is why we added that plugin. We'll talk about that more later. But for the most part, this just sort of starts up our application. You don't really need to worry too much about this file for now. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my app.vue file. And this is the first file that really shows you what working in Vue is going to be like. So at the top of the file, you see I have this template HTML block with some HTML inside of it. And then down beneath it, I have a style tag. So in general, the way that you're going to think about building Vue applications is by constructing components. So instead of thinking about your website in terms of pages, what you want to do is you want to think about it in terms of components on that page, right? So you might have a header, and then you might have a body, and inside that body, maybe you have a contact form, right? Each of those three things, the header, the body, and the contact form, are potentially going to be components on this web page. So the way that you construct the Vue application is you build each of those components separately, and then you bring them together into a single application. So you'll see more about exactly what that's like as we go through the tutorial today. But ultimately, what I want to point out in this app.vue file is that we have the ID app here. So this is where our application is actually going to live. And you can see we have some stuff here about the router. So I'm going to ignore that for now, and I'll come back to it later. What I want to do next is actually browse to the source components file. And you can see that there's this hello world.vue file in the components folder, right? So if I open this up, you can see at the top, again, we have this template that has some HTML in it. Below that, we have a script tag. And then below that, we have a style scoped tag. So this component here is a full-fledged Vue component. A Vue component is going to be made up of HTML stored in a template tag, and that's going to be the markup of the component. It's going to have JavaScript, which runs the functionality of it, right? The actual code that you're writing is stored in the script tag. And then there's a style tag, and the style tag is what is going to actually style the component specifically. So with those three elements, you have your HTML, your JavaScript, and your CSS. That's how you build out these Vue components. So let's take a little bit deeper of look. So inside of this template, you can see that we have a div with the class of hello, and then we are echoing out a message, and then we have a bunch of other sort of static HTML. So if we actually pull open our Vue app here, you can see that this page that we have right here is what's being rendered with this. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to delete all of this static HTML. I'm going to save the file. I'm going to go back into the web browser. And you can see that now we still have our message being output, but none of that static HTML below it. And so this message, and again, if you've seen the previous video, you should notice that we're just sort of echoing out a message. And you can see if we come down, this message isn't defined as data, but instead it's defined as props, right? And then it's a message with a string. So if we were to overwrite this and instead do something like this, right, which is similar to what we had done in the previous video, if we go back in here, you can see refreshing sort of breaks the page. And that's because these props are different than the data that we were looking at before. So essentially, these props are properties that you need to specify when you create a hello world component, right? So we're in components, hello world, we name it hello world, and then when you're actually including this in your HTML markup, you need to specify a property of message, and that message is then going to be available to this component. So in order to see exactly what I mean here, let's open up Vue's home.vue. So in home.vue, you can see that we have this image with the Vue logo, right? And so if I go back in here and I just refresh this page again, we're back to where we need to be. The logo here is just included in this view. So if I delete this logo and I save it, and we come back, you can see the logo is now gone, and we're just left with this message. So the way that the home view is working is we have this hello world component, right? It's just an HTML tag, hello world, and you can see that we specify a property of message, which is welcome to your Vue.js app. Of course, you could come in and you could change this, and you might say, you know, just hello world. If we save this now, we go back, you can see our message is updating now. So components themselves, you can specify properties on. These properties can then be included when you include that component in the HTML markup. You can see that in order to include this hello world, we need to import it from components/hello world. And we also need to register it as a component inside of this view that we have here, right? So this view is called home, and then it requires the component of hello world. Inside of our hello world component, you can also see that in this style tag, we have this property specified as scoped. When you specify a style scoped, this CSS is only going to apply to the component that you're working within. So to show you exactly what I mean, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here, I'm going to take a paragraph tag, and I'm just going to give it some styling. Okay. Now I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to change this message to be included in a paragraph tag instead of the H1. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to go back to the web page. You can see that it got this styling. Now if I come into this home.view file, beneath this, I'm going to add a paragraph tag. I'm just going to say this will not be styled. So if I go back here, you can see that it's a paragraph tag still, but it's not styled where the paragraph tag here is styled. So this is a really effective way, instead of having sort of incredibly complicated class structures like you might be used to having, is you can just attach styling directly to the component and everything's sort of isolated. Of course, I could come in here, I could say style and maybe make it scoped here, and then just make the paragraph tag say color blue, right? And if I go back into this, you can see that it is now blue. That gives you some sense of how the styling here is working. So I just want to dig a little bit more into what this JavaScript is doing here. So you can see that we have this export default, and then we have an object. And essentially the way that you can think about this is specifying exactly what the component is as a JavaScript object, right? So we need to give it a name, and this name of hello world is actually how we're going to reference it from these different components within the view that we want to include it in, right? So we're importing hello world, which is specified from here, right? That's where the name is coming from. And then, of course, we've seen that you can specify properties on it. Of course, we're going to be able to sort of treat this like we were doing in the previous video, where you can start providing data and methods and that type of thing to your components. But we'll get into that in just a little bit here. So I'm going to bring up the application once again, and you see that there's an about link, and so when you click on this, we're directed to an about page. Now I want you to notice that when we click between these links, we're not actually refreshing the page. We're not changing what's being loaded. We're just sort of opening up the about. The one thing that does change is we get this /about up here. And so what's actually happening here is we're using that router that we imported, which is going to let us react to different URL strings at the end here and load different content dynamically, but without needing to refresh the page, reload everything. And so this provides a really seamless user experience. And so let's figure out exactly what's happening here. So if we go back to the app.view, you can see that we have this router link to /, and then we have a router link to /about. And so those are actually the two links that we're clicking on here, home and about. And you can see when we click on home, we go to just a /, and when we go to about, we go to /about. Down beneath the navigation here, we have a router view. And so this router view is actually the component that is pulling in all of the content from the different views that we have over here. So to understand exactly what's happening, I want you to open up router.js. And so in this, we see that we're actually creating our router object here. Now the router object has a routes property attached to it, and this routes property is a JavaScript list. Now within this list, we're going to specify the different routes that we want our application to react to. So each of these routes is an object itself, and we're specifying a name, a path, and a component for each of these. So the home route's really easy to see, right? The path is going to be /. We're going to name it home, and we want it to load the component home. Now this component home is being imported from views.home.view, right, which is this home.view file we've been looking at. So this home.view is a component itself, and when we visit the home route, which has a path of /, that's what we want to load, is this home.view. And you can see when we click on home, we're at the route with just a /, and that code from the home.view file is loaded up here. Now, the route for the about page is slightly more confusing looking, right? So the path /about and the name of it, about, those exactly correspond to the path and the name, like the home route, right? But you can see that we have this component, and then we're importing a web chunk name. So the idea here is that when we open up the application for the first time, any of the paths that are specified like this are going to have their components loaded automatically. This component is only going to be imported when we actually visit the about route for the first time. So this is being lazy loaded when the route's visited. And so basically this is going to let your page load more quickly because you don't need to load all of the assets from the about page until you've actually visited the about page. And so if a user comes to your site and they never end up visiting the about page, you're never going to end up loading the about page. Now, all of this is going to be discussed in more detail as I talk more about the advanced features of Vue. So for now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to remove all of this, and I'm just going to want to specify the component to be about, right? And what we're actually going to have to do is we're going to have to come into the top of the file here, and we're going to want to import about from, and then we'll specify views about.view. We'll save this. We'll go back to our application, and now you can see we still can click in and around. So for now, you should be able to just think about your route specified like this, but know that there are more advanced features that we'll get into later on. Now, to finish up this routing before we build our own component and include it here, all I want to do is show you what happens when we change a path. So if I come in and I change this path to be new home here, and I save it, and then I open back up the application, you can see that clicking on home, now we're not loading anything. And that's because this no longer loads the home route. In order to see that, we need to come here and go to new home, and then you can see the home page is loaded properly. Of course, I can click on about again. Now, clicking on this home button is not going to work because in our app.view, you can see that the router link, which links to a different route, is to /. And so we'd want to make that to / new home. And now when you click on this, this is going to be a link to the route that we've specified at new home. So now if I click here, you can see we're brought home. So that's great, working exactly like we need it to. And of course, you can start playing around. If you just want to build a static web page, you sort of have all of the tools you need now. You can just go in, start building out your components. Everything sort of works nicely. Now, what I want to do is actually build out the same counter feature that I had on my previous tutorial, except this time building it as a component and including it in this application here. In order to do this, you can think about how exactly you want to have your counter structured. what I want to do is I actually want to have a counter view, right? So it's going to be a different page that just displays the counter. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the two buttons, the plus and the minus button, as different components, just so we can see the whole process. Now, this is probably not the most efficient way of actually constructing this in an application, but it's going to do just fine and sort of illustrate how we might go about this. So the first thing that I want to do is actually create the route that's going to let us have our counter object. So I'm going to come into the router.js. I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to change back the home path just to be a / to make things easy. I'm going to make a path, and I'm going to have / counter. I'm going to name it counter, and then I need to specify the component, and my component's going to be called counter. Now I need to obviously import this as well, so we're going to import counter from, and I'm going to store it in the views, counter.view. So we'll save this. This is obviously not going to be working yet because we don't have that file. So I'm going to come into the views, create counter.view, and then in this counter, we need to essentially have a template and a script specified. So what I want to do is come into here. I'm going to say template with HTML, and I'm just going to have a div with an ID of counter. Now, one important feature to note is that within this template, you need to have a single HTML element. If you have multiple elements here, things are going to break. It's not going to work. If you don't have anything, same thing. Now, we also need a script tag. Here, we're going to do script with JavaScript, and you can see that it's export default, right, which is what we need. And we need to specify a name, and we also will need to specify whatever components this relies on. But for now, we're just going to specify the name is going to be counter, right, because that's what we called it before. And just to make things clear, I'm going to start a counter h1 tag here so that we can see everything that we need. Now we're just about ready to reload up our application, but I just want to create a link here to the counter so that we can easily navigate. So I'm just going to come in here, duplicate this router link, right? And it's going to go to / counter, and I'm just going to specify the text to be counter. So now if I open up the web page here, you can see this counter button exists. I can click on it, takes me to / counter. That h1 tag is there. So everything's working as we would expect it to. So now, in order to actually build out this counter, what we're going to want to do is have a count displayed, and then we're going to want to have add and subtract buttons on that count. So we can do this much in the same way that we had done it previously in the last video, right? So I'm going to go through things a little bit quickly here, but if you're not sure about any of what I'm doing, then go check that video out where I describe this process in more detail. But so I'm going to add a data, and I'm going to specify that it's going to be a count, and we're going to initialize it to be 0. And then I'm going to come in here, and I'm just going to output my count. Now, I also want those two buttons, but like I said, I want those buttons to be components themselves. So I'm going to want to have an add button component, and I'm going to want to have a sub button component, right? These components don't exist yet, so let's make them. So I'm going to come into my components folder. I'm going to say add component.view, and I'm going to make a new one for sub component.view. Okay, and let's just clean up. We don't need the hello world or the router open anymore, and we can actually close the home and the app as well. So now we need to actually import these components, right? So we're going to say import, and then one thing that you can do here is to get to this source folder, you can just use the @ symbol, and the @ symbol will get you up to your source folder. So then we can just go components, add component.view, and of course from here we're importing the add component, and it's going to be from that URL. Just duplicate that down, subcomponent from subcomponents.view, and then finally we need to come in here and we need to specify the components. And we want the add component, and we want the subcomponent. And we need a comma here to make sure that that's still properly formatted. Now in this add component, let's make a template, and I'm just going to actually include this as a button directly, and I'm just going to write +1 on it for now. Again, we're just trying to get sort of the minimal amount of markup so that our page loads correctly. So this is a template. It's just going to be a simple button here. I'm going to say a script, and then I want to give this the name add component so that when we export it, things are correct. And then I'm going to do the same thing here. So it's a template and a button. Of course, this one's -1, and I want a script, and I'm going to name this subcomponent. So if I save all of these files, so just notice that I called these add button and sub button here, but I've been referring to them as add component and subcomponent. So I'm just going to come in here and change this. Now, when we actually go back to the page, what you're going to see is that this doesn't quite work as I have it set up. So I have the buttons here, and of course they don't do anything, but you'll notice that I don't have my count being output. And the reason for that is that in order to specify the data on a component, we have to do things a little bit differently than we did on the app itself. So instead of specifying data as sort of a property of this, we're actually going to specify data as a function, okay? And this data function is going to be called and return the data that we need. So here, now what I want to do is return a JavaScript object that has the count of 0. And the reason for this is that oftentimes your data function is going to say connect to an external API and pull in the data that way. So this sort of allows you to think more about creating the data from wherever the source is instead of just having it be static. But for here, I'm just going to return this this data object exactly like this. So now if we go back into this, you should see we get the data output. Of course, our buttons don't do anything, but they are there. And so we can start to actually work on building out this functionality. The first thing that we want to do is get this add button actually working. And essentially, the way that we want to do this is we want to react to the user clicking, and specifically, we want to send out the event that the user's clicked on this button. Okay, so I'm going to come into the button here, and I'm going to say v_on_click, right? So we're reacting to the click, and I'm going to use this special notation, and I'm just going to say inc count here, and I forgot to type emit. So it's $emit and then inc count. So what this is saying is that when the button is clicked, we want to emit an event with the name increment count. And this event is going to be detectable by the add component component in our markup, right? So you can think about this. If I had said emit click, then this would be like responding to the click event that's provided by default in JavaScript. So this is a way that we're allowed to define our own events. And so I'm going to just define this as inc count. It's not a great name for an event. It should actually probably be something like inc count click, but for now we'll leave it like this so that you get the point. So when I click on this now, this event's going to be emitted, but we still need to be able to react to that event. And so the place that we're going to do this is in our counter directly. And so, like I said, it's this add component that's emitting the event. So what we want to do here is essentially add a watcher, and we say v_on and then inc count, right? So this is, again, exactly as though we're responding to a click event, but here we're responding to the increment count event. And then, of course, you can just provide the function that you want to respond with. And so I'm going to just call it increment. And then you need to come in here and actually specify the method, exactly like we did before. So that's going to be methods, increment, function, and then all I'm going to do is this dot count plus plus. I'm going to go back in here, refresh this. When I click this, you can see that the counter is incrementing. Of course, the decrement button does not do anything yet, so let's go in and fix that. So if I go to subcomponent, again, when we click this, when the user clicks this in Vue, what we want to do is we want to emit a sub count event. So I'm going to save this. And so now within our subcomponent here, we want to respond to the sub count event, and we're going to specify a decrement function here. We're going to come into the methods here. We're going to specify a decrement, which is going to be a function, and it's going to be this.count minus minus. Then we save that, go back into our web page here, and you can see we can add and subtract. Now, this is, again, not a super useful application, but I hope you can start to see how Vue becomes an incredibly powerful framework to work within. And obviously there's going to be a lot more that you can do, but the general structure is going to be, let's create some views. Those views are going to be the HTML pages we're looking at. They pull in the different components where we can react to them. Now, one note that I will point out is that if I count up to 5 or 10 or whatever here, right, and then I click the home button, I go back to the counter, you can see it's reset to 0. Now, the reason that this is happening is that the data here is being stored on the counter component itself, not on the application. And so if you actually wanted to build this out, you would actually want to have this data stored sort of above where it's stored here in the stack, right? But we'll see that type of thing as we look at more advanced videos into the future. So for now, I hope this gives you all of the tools you need to start feeling comfortable playing around